Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Put the microphone on, that would help. There we go. Okay. Any different? Yeah. Good evening. Welcome. I'm Craig Snyder, the president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. We always try to be topical and timely in our programming. If I do say so myself, I kind of think we nailed it tonight. And I'm really delighted to see a full room. You all braved the fortifications, the fortification formerly known as Center City, to be able to join us, and I really appreciate your being here. As always, some obligatory announcements to start. If you haven't already done so, please silence your cell phones and other electronic devices. However, we always encourage you to tweet after our speaker's remarks, and we invite you to like the World Affairs Council on Facebook if you haven't already done so. I want to just mention very quickly some of our exciting upcoming events for the remainder of 2015. I hope you will all mark your calendars for October 14th, when the Council will present its prestigious Atlas Award to the Human Rights Project for Girls, acknowledging its important work against human trafficking. And we will also be presenting our award to our outgoing chairman, John Walsh, whose reputation as a supporter of education and charitable causes in our region is unparalleled. The keynote speaker that evening will be Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, who was one of the principal co-sponsors of the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act. Then, looking ahead, a week later, October 21st, Democratic political insider David Brock will be joining us to discuss his provocatively titled new book, Killing the Messenger, the Right-Wing Plot to Derail Hillary and Hijack Your Government. Not real clear where he stands, but if you come on the 21st of October, you'll get all the details. I hope then you will also not miss our evening on November 17th with really an icon of television broadcasting, formerly with ABC News, Ted Koppel, who has decided to take on a very important and complex, perplexing in many ways topic, that being cybersecurity, and has written a book about the danger of future cyber attacks against the United States. All of these events and the Council's citizen diplomacy tours support our program, our most important program, for a diverse group of over 2,200 middle and high school students in 90 schools throughout the Philadelphia area, fostering the skills and sensibilities that the next generation needs to thrive and compete in the global community. Now to the heart of tonight's program. As the week-long World Meeting of Families and Pope Francis's first visit to the United States and, of course, to Philadelphia are upon us, it's important for us to recognize and understand the changes going on within the Catholic Church and the man spearheading what our guest this evening has called a revolution. That man, of course, being Pope Francis. Most people, Catholics and those of other religions alike, are familiar and are certainly becoming much more familiar this week with some of the ways in which Pope Francis is different than many of his predecessors regarding sometimes controversial theological, political, and social views. Here with us tonight to discuss these questions is internationally acclaimed journalist and author Marco Politi. He is a leading expert on Vatican issues with more than 40 years' experience. He is a journalist with the newspaper. Can you help me with the pronunciation here? Fatto Quotidiano. And was the Vatican correspondent for La Repubblica. His recent book, see featured here, Pope Francis Among the Wolves, The Inside Story of a Revolution, Mr. Politi elaborates on the current struggles of the Catholic Church and how Pope Francis has taken over conflicting views on the future of the Church around the world and is seeking to put his own stamp on that ancient and important institution. I would like you to join me now in welcoming Marco Politi for his opening remarks.
So, buonasera, as the Pope would say. The Pope and his enemies. We must not be scared by the fact that conflicts are part in the history of the Catholic Church. The period of Vatican Council II was a period of strong tensions between the different groups, between the different opinions. Every time when it is the moment of reforms, there are tensions, clashes, struggle within the Catholic Church. In the first centuries after Christ, the first council, even the bishops were beating each other. Now, luckily, this didn't happen. But Cardinal Casper, just at the eve of this synod, which will discuss important things about the family, you know, the possibility of communion for divorced, remarried people, or the acceptance of, not of the individual gay, but of the gay partnership. Cardinal Casper has said, we must pray because a battle is ongoing. Pope Francis is a challenging personality, and for this reason, challenging outside of the church and challenging inside in the church. And for this reason, he meets a lot of resistance. He meets resistance when he supports the cleanup of the Vatican Bank. He meets resistance when he wants to reorganize, not technically the Curia, when he wants to reorganize the mission of the Curia, which must not be anymore a sort of censor, a sort of custom office, which says you can in, you can go out, which must not be like in past. It has formed so through the centuries, a sort of high military commando which gives order to the universal church and to the different local churches. Pope Francis meets resistance when it comes up to sexual issues, or also when it comes up to say, as he has stated, that women must go into places where they take decisions within the church and where they exert authority. This is something completely new. Past popes have spoken very well of women, about what they have done, about the sainthood, about many congregations founded by women, but this is the first pope who underlines, he puts it as a goal. Until now, there has not been very much concrete, but he puts the goal that women come into positions, for instance, in the Curia, where decisions are taken and where authority is exerted. If we analyze this papacy, which is so dynamic, with so many new things happen months after months, we must not forget 2 points. First, this is a time-limited papacy. The resigning of Pope Benedict has put a precedent also for the future. Pope Benedict didn't resign because he was scared or he was too old or too weak. Certainly, he was old. But Benedict was very far-sighted in the moment when he resigned, when he said, you must remember that the head of the church is not the Pope, but is Jesus Christ. And it is necessary that the Pope is interconnected, quote, with the rapid changes of the time. So it is not only because he was becoming older, as he was explaining to the cardinals in his speech, but also because a Pope must be connected with the rapid change of the times and of the society. This means that it is no more possible, like it was in the past, in the Middle Ages, for instance, that an old Pope sits in the Vatican like an icon and somebody else behind his back or near him rules the church. the Pope must always be the real ruling person. And as we had after Vatican Council II, we saw for the first time retired bishops. It didn't exist before the reform of Paul VI. Bishops were long-life bishops. So this is the beginning of an era, of a new era of the resigning popes. Of course, every pope will decide by himself, but the precedent has been set, and this pope, Pope Francis, has already said, just in an interview in his second anniversary, a couple of months ago, I think that my papacy will last 4 or 5 years. So 2 years have already passed, even if we don't want mathematically precise, but this means that he himself just is convinced that at a certain moment he has to go. So this is one point, a term-limited papacy. Of course, the fact that it is a term-limited papacy stirs up even more the resistance and the opponent. And the other point to take in account is that the Pope was elected by a constituency which didn't expect the revolution he was bringing to the church.
Was elected by a constituency that kind of didn't know what they were getting. They may have gotten more than they bargained for. And yet, as you detail, he ended up having substantially more votes than he needed to be elected. He ended up with a very substantial majority in the conclave. Briefly, how did it happen? How did he come to be elected with that kind of strong support?
This conclave in the year 2013 was completely different from the conclave of the year 2005, because when John Paul II died, already Cardinal Ratzinger was a leading personality at the eve of the conclave. He is a great theologian, a great preacher, an intellectual. He was known worldwide. He had also had, in Munich, for instance, some dialogue with the philosopher Habermas. So already a very strong group of supporters in the first days already after the death of John Paul II were pushing for Cardinal Ratzinger. The only opponent of the same level, let's say for the reformist tendency, could have been Cardinal Martini of Milano, a person who had already spoken in the early 90s about the necessity maybe of a Vatican Council III, and to rethink the sexual ethics, to rethink about the role of the women in the church, to rethink the fact that there are less and less priests, but also Martini had Parkinson. So it was impossible to have two popes, one after the other, with Parkinson ill. And in that moment, the reformist group decided to support Bergoglio, but there was no possibility for Bergoglio to get the votes, and he himself didn't feel ready. In Argentina, they have told me, you know, sometimes in the Old Testament, God calls a prophet and says, go and speak. And he says, no, I can't speak, I am too timid, and so he needs a second time, a second chance. In this synod, the atmosphere before was very divided. The people had not a strong candidate. But there was a group, also in the Roman Curia, and among European and American cardinals, who wanted a real change. They didn't want anymore an Italian pope, they didn't want no pope linked to the Secretary of State, Cardinal Bertone, who had been the Secretary of State of Pope Benedict. They thought that there were too many intrigues in the Roman Curia. Maybe this is also a stereotype, but they wanted a real change. And that's the reason why, for instance, the Cardinal Scherer of São Paulo in Brazil couldn't get enough votes because he was too linked to Cardinal Bertone, and he was too linked also to the management of the Vatican Bank. So day after day, when the cardinals were looking, 2 days before the end of the 9 days discussion before the conclave, they heard the speech of Bergoglio, the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, when he was speaking about the necessity that to go out, to go to the peripheries, to meet the men and the women in the most difficult situation. And so they were impressed by his sense of evangelization. And slowly, in the last moment, the consensus was coming around him. But certainly, they wanted a good priest, a good pastor, a good pope. They were not prepared for all the reforms and new things and the reshaping of the church, which Bergoglio showed very quickly after his election.
You write extensively about the life of the Pope as the Archbishop, and even before, in Argentina. Can you tell our guests what marks you think are most important on him from his life in Buenos Aires?
You don't find in my book a biography of Francis before he became Pope. I wanted to focus on this new papacy. But there was something which had to be explained and which I caught in the moment when I came to Buenos Aires, that nobody had noticed at the moment when he was proclaimed Pope and when he spoke to the crowd in place in St. Peter's Square. Because with a lot of humor and self-irony, he said, "My brethren, the cardinals, have taken me from the end of the world." That's a very wrong idea, because Buenos Aires is a million town. Greater Buenos Aires is made by 13 millions of people. You find in Buenos Aires everything, from skyscrapers like here till the most miserable slums. And you find a lot of social layers, wealthy, less wealthy, enough wealthy, middle class, high middle class, little middle class, poor people, impoverished people, and these terrible shanty towns, which are really towns because they are made up by 25,000 people, 40,000 people, 60,000 people. And Buenos Aires is a million metropolis where there are all the religions. This is not a pope who grew up in a village of Bavaria, of Poland, or of Italy. Villages which were almost 100% Catholic. Already the fact that Wojtyla was born in a village where there was a Jewish minority had a great impact on his growing up and also on his papacy. So a personality is formed by the milieu, by the environment, by the cultural environment in which one lives and grows up. So in Buenos Aires there are all the religions. There are Protestants, there are Catholics, there are Muslims, there are Jews, there are free churches, there are Pentecostals, there are Oriental religions. There is a strong anti-clerical Freemasonry tradition. So he has learned to live within the complexity of the modern world. This is the first pope who comes from the global world. And that's the reason why, in the same time, also going every week, not every 5 years, going every week into these slums, when he speaks about social problems, he knows personally what he's speaking about. The social doctrine of the church is very strong against a greedy, profit-oriented economy. Also, John Paul II, people forgets it, but John Paul II, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, was speaking of the great risk of a radical
capitalist ideology. He said it especially in Germany. So the social doctrine of the church in the last 50 years has not changed. It is pro-free market, but against a unbridled, unfettered capitalism. But the special characteristic of Francis is that he knows personally, he has touched misery, he has touched drugs, bosses, he has touched organized criminality, he has touched in his life, he has seen what means to work in an illegal factory, what means human trafficking. For example, people coming from remote parts of Argentina, in the interior of Argentina, brought like slave workers into Buenos Aires, or also the human trafficking for sexual reasons. This is all things he knows. That's the reason why he understands so well the crisis which is going on in great parts, not only of the third world, but also of the first world. If I may tell about Italy, we have in Italy a great town near Florence, Prato, where there are many Chinese factories, and you don't know who is working there inside. There are hundreds of people who work 14 hours, who live in these factories. You have in South Italy during the summer, immigrants who have to pick up tomatoes practically for very, very few money. This year, 4 people have died. And the newspapers have written more because of these 4 people, 2 were Italians. Or you have also in other parts of Italy illegal factories where Bengali people are working for a textile factory. So these are not phenomena only of the third world, and he knows it well. That's the specific of the Buenos Aires experience of Francis.
Thank you. You talk in the book about a sort of a contemporary continuum among the Catholic laity between devout believers in the developing world and people who you call disillusioned in Europe. Where do you think, from your observations, American Catholics stand in that continuum? And to what extent do you think that this visit is designed to address that?
Well, for the Pope, the visit to the United States, but for all the popes, is always a moment where they learn a lot, because America is a very complex society. But if you see today's edition of the Washington Post, you can see how dwindling are the numbers of priests, of nuns. This is the last very alarming phenomenon in all the Catholic Church, because until recently, the women, even if they were not respected by the hierarchy, the women were the backbone of the organization of the church, especially the religious order of the women. Were and are the backbone. There are hospitals, there are charities, there are a lot of initiatives all over the world where the women religious are in the first front. And you see here the number who is absolutely falling. The numbers about the nuns, the religious, the women orders is appalling. It's not only an American phenomenon, it is in the first world very widespread. So you have in the United States also, Pope Benedict was emphasizing it many times, and he was right, a religious society with a part who really takes serious the religious engagement. But nobody can now close their eyes in front of these figures, falling figures of the troops of the church, the clergy and the religious women, and the new fact, completely new in the last, let's say, 15 years, all over in the northern hemisphere, is that the youth is losing any organic contact with the parishes and with the church as a structure. You have today a youth which is interested maybe in religious matters, or in spirituality, better to say. You have a youth today who listens a lot to what the Pope is saying, or you had a youth who were enthusiastic about John Paul II, but this is only focused on single events. It doesn't mean that this youth continues to go to the church. Or if they go to the church, for instance in Italy, they go till the confirmation, 12, 13 years, and then they abandon the church. Maybe they come later back when they are parents, but it's not anymore a mass phenomenon. So this problem is not only a problem of the American society, it's a problem in Europe, it's a problem also in Italy. It's a problem in Italy. In Italy, the last researches show that also the young girls today are on the same level of non-interest of the young boys. Until 10 or 20 years ago, there was always a difference in the church attendance of women and of girls related to boys and men. And now, the new generation, there is no more difference between the indifference of girls and boys.
I want to ask a couple of questions about your assessment of the Pope as a politician. It's a commonplace in American political thinking that when a president, our most important figure obviously, has an agenda that's too long, tries to do too many big things, that it can be a recipe for failure. Most, again, sort of in the conventional wisdom of the thing, pick 2 or 3 big things, push for them, and you might succeed and you might be able to build on that. Your list, your description of the Pope's agenda and the speeches we've heard given in the last 2 days, it's a very long agenda of change, a revolution, as you say. From a tactical point of view, do you think that that makes it much less likely that he can succeed because he's taking on so many different issues and so many different interests that oppose his point of view?
I think that in general you are right. But the way of thinking of Pope Francis is different. A few days before he was leaving for Rome to take part in the conclave, he met a delegation of a religious order from Europe, and he was speaking about the parable of the Good Shepherd. So 99 sheep are with the flock, and the Good Shepherd leaves the flock to find the lost sheep. But he said, the situation now is the other way around. 99 are outside, and only 1 is in the flock. So, the Pope, of course, is, as we say in Italy, he's opening a lot of battlefronts. I think it is understandable also in English, yes. He's opening a lot of battlefronts because he feels that it is time to give also an intellectual shock, not also a religious shock, to structures who have been fossilized. Cardinal Martini, a few days before dying, he died 1 year before the election, the resigning of Pope Benedict, was saying there is too much dust in the church. Why this church is so pompous? Why all the churches, or many times, are empty? I go in Italy, I see beautiful churches. Some of you have been to Florence, for instance. Beautiful churches, and on Sunday you find 20 people or 15. And Cardinal Martini was saying, maybe the church is behind 200 years. Francis was not a Martini follower, but Francis shares certainly the idea that many things have to change. So he has a very broad agenda. But he is concentrated on one main point, which is the collegiality, which means involving the bishops in the decision-taking moment. That's because the synod is important. The synod is important because he leaves to them, to their responsibility, to decide what will you do with remarried, divorced people, what will you do with homosexuals, what will you do on other points of the agenda. It is not him who goes to the window in St. Peter's Square and says, tomorrow we'll make so and so, because he wants to change also the authoritarian imperial structure of the Catholic Church. So, if he succeeds in making that this decision-making structure of the synod becomes rolling, becomes working, then it will be a success. But he himself knows that he's like a sower. He's not the man who will reap the harvest. He's not obsessed by showing I did it. He wants just to open a new dynamic in the Catholic Church in order to overcome this over-centralized moment and to make a participatory church. Because in the moment when the bishops really know that they are part of the decision process, it means also that the diocese, the believers, the faithful, can interact within their diocese with the bishop. And for the Pope it's important the process. That's because he is not concerned, even if you give democracy, maybe you have not the majority, like it was in the last synod. This is not so important for him. The important is that the bishops feel that they decide. They vote, they decide for real proposals. Maybe last time he didn't win, we can say in a secular way. Maybe this time the synod will end with a compromise, but for him it's important that the process goes on.
Last question, and then we'll open to the audience. A little bit of devil's advocate, to use a church term. One of the groups that may turn into wolves, that may show opposition to Pope Francis, is the American conservative movement. The only Catholics running for president at the moment are in the Republican Party. And they've been very critical of the Pope's views on immigration, on climate change, and on the Pope's definition of the problems and the excesses of capitalism. So in fashioning this trip and the things that would be said on this trip, how much attention do you think there was played, if at all, in the Pope's thinking to appearing partisan in the American political context?
The Pope didn't care very much. For one simple reason, because the Pope didn't want to come here to teach lessons. He has said, I come as a brother. The Pope never goes into a nation to teach lessons. The Pope expresses very clearly what are his concerns and what for him is important for the gospel. He has used very tough words during the only Easter Mass which was organized for the Italian parliamentaries, for the House of the Deputies. And after that Mass, there was no other Easter Mass for Italian politicians, because he was speaking and saying, remember what happened in the times of Jesus, where the doctors of law, the Pharisees, they thought that they knew better everything, and they were very far from the population and from the problems of the population. The Pope knows that he is divisive on climate change or on social issues, but he has a very simple idea. These are problems which are on the threshold of our houses. He can be divisive, certainly, but in the US there are 11 millions of illegal immigrants. That's a fact. Nobody can think, even if Donald Trump speaks in this time and has a lot of supporters, that you can deportate 11 million people. So the problems exist. We see it in Europe now. You have this wave, unprecedented wave of people fleeing from the Middle East, but they don't flee only from the wars. They come from deepest Africa because they are starving. And the Pope wants politicians to think about the problem, to find the recipes. It's not him, he says it very clearly. It's not the church who has to give the recipes, but you have to think. For in Africa, in the last century, in the past centuries, nobody was starving. They were poor, but they were not starving. Why it is so that now people is starving? What does it mean that you have in Africa these big metropolis, for instance, in Nigeria, Lagos, what does it mean? It is another social context. And if you can say, also Benedict had very tough words against the corruption of the political class of Africa, then the Pope says, hey, but who is giving the money to corrupt? The money comes from somewhere. And he says the same thing now when we speak about war or when we speak about the caliphate. You have to stop the ISIS caliphate, but at the same time you must ask to whom they sell the petrol? Who is financing them to buy the arms? So in this moment the Pope is not only the voice of a religious conscience, but also of a rational intelligence who says, put the right questions and try to find the right answers. It is true that the conservatives in this moment are more active than the pro-reformers. This you have it at the eve of this synod. There has been a great mobilization of conservatives. There is a petition of 400,000 signatures. Cardinal Berker was very active in this field. 400,000 signatures to say to the Pope, stop any reform. And more than 100 bishops have signed. There will be in Rome at the end of the month a great international
autocratic culture to a democratic culture, and let me illustrate that by a couple of things. For example, parish councils, instead of being advisory, would have the same power as the board of directors of a corporation, with the religious being the management. Same thing on the diocesan level, the diocesan council, diocesan. And it seems to me, and I'm interested in your opinion as to whether such a shift from autocracy to democracy could occur under this Pope.
Please.
Yeah, the issue of term limits is really troubling, and you're making it even more troubling, because, you know, what this Pope is doing is he's articulating what, in my view, the best elements of the Catholic Church have always said, but he's doing it on a world stage like no other Pope has done it. That's great. So we have term limits, he goes away, and the next Pope goes back into a shell and says it here and there, we lose that whole thing. This is like a puff of smoke we're talking about here. So without some serious institutional reforms like women priests, married priests, recognition of gay and lesbians, or some of the things this gentleman said, this is all just a puff of smoke. There's got to be serious institutional reforms, and what worries me is he's only going to be around for 4 or 5 years. It's not happening. I don't see it happening.
I'm going to stop there in terms of this formal question period after Marco answers. We're going to have at least 15 minutes where Marco will be available at the back table signing books, and if there are further questions, which I think there are, you have the opportunity to ask them then, just not to keep everybody in this hot room longer than necessary. Please.
Let's say, let's be very frank on some issues. I mean, frank as observers, not partisan of one issue or another issue. I find it absolutely normal that there would be also women priests in the Catholic Church as there are in other Protestant denominations. Or that there should be married priests like in Orthodox churches or in Anglican and Protestant denominations. But certainly, married priests will not resolve the great crisis of secularization. So it is right to hope or to push or to ask for married priests, but as we have seen in the Protestant world, it doesn't increase the number of the faithful. Because there is a great wave of secularization. This is a great phenomenon which goes beyond the fact if there are married priests or not, or if there are women priests or not. I repeat, it is absolutely right to ask it and to make it, but it doesn't help the great crisis of secularization. What kind of collegiality could be envisaged? I speak as observer in this moment. I think that the idea of the Pope is to learn from the Orthodox experience. In the Orthodox experience, the Patriarch is the head of the Church, but the Council, the Synod of the Metropolits decides really together with the Patriarch. Let's make an example. The Russian Patriarch was tempted in the last 20 years, at least 2 times, to accept the invitation of the Roman Pontiff to meet. But every time when they were at the verge of this meeting, the Synod of the Orthodox Russian Church decided to say, no, the situation is not right. So the Pope has said very clearly, I don't want to be like a CEO of a corporation. I want to continue to be the pontiff who had the last word. But he wants the bishops to be really part of the decision-making process. And he wants the bishop to make real proposals about how to solve the problems. When a Brazilian bishop came to him speaking about the great crisis of the new priests and speaking about the necessity maybe to come to the system which in Latin is called viri probati, which means that you ordain ripe men of a great, engaged, faithful life. This could be everybody, an engineer, a teacher of 50, 60 years, who is married. The Pope said, and that's characteristic for him, make proposals. So it is not me who will go and say, tomorrow there are married priests, or there are these viri probati, these ripe men, married, who can be ordained priests. Make proposals. Make it so that the Brazilian Bishops' Conference comes out with this proposal. So this is the way he wants to build participation. Democracy is a word we can use from a secularized point of view, but if we look at the steps, this is the first step he wants to make. The issue of the next Pope is very important, because if we remember Vatican Council II, John XXIII made the revolution. He stayed 5 years, but the great weaver was Paul VI. And it took him 15 years, a papacy of 15 years, to bring the whole church, or almost the whole church, even if there was the schisma of the pious fraternity. He brought the great mass of the church on the direction of Vatican Council II. So it will be not only important to see how the battle of the next synod goes, to see how many are the conservatives, how many are the reformers, and the next synod will be decided by the undecided. It will be decided by those people who until now didn't speak out and maybe have not yet an opinion. But the complex of this long list of reforms, as our chairman said, depends on what kind of pope, maybe a more diplomatic pope, will be elected after Francis.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.